Welcome to this webinar on evolutionary testing strategy by Gayathri. And before moving on and telling you a little bit about us, I would like to give a huge shout out to Browser Stack, our annual sponsors for all our community events and premier sponsors for all conferences. Now, coming to one of our conferences, our big conferences that is coming up, and I'm sure you might have heard a lot about it, might be seeing it all over the social media also. And some of you might have also booked your tickets. Uh, we have a offline conference coming up. It's on 14th and 15th of July. Around 20 plus speakers will be there. It will be for 2 days. We have 10 plus teams, and around 110 plus testers have already confirmed their slots, and many more are in the line to just book their tickets. So if you want to attend somewhere where around 300 people will be there and you can network with them, you can interact with them. So do join this conference. Like I said, we have 20 plus speakers. We have expert talks, panel discussions, networking, job fair, one mentoring. Now, something about our speaker, I would love to call up Gayathri on the stage. But before that, Gayatri right now is a principal consultant at ThoughtWorks. And to tell you a little bit about her, the first time I talked to her was when her first book came out, the book about full stack testing came out. And I saw a lot of posts on that. Everyone was appreciating about that, and then I reached out to her to just talk to her about what her thoughts are and if she would like to do a webinar with us. And now this is the second webinar, and she is very sweet and I love to talk to her. So now I would like to call her up on the stage. Yeah, what do you guys think now? You can
Hello.
share.
Hi, Vanchika. Thank you. Thanks for the brief introduction. And I'm very glad to be here today. And I also see a good number of participation from folks on a Saturday afternoon. Really encouraging to see that. So, without further ado, let me share my screen and get to the topic. Awesome. So, evolutionary testing strategy, that's the topic that we are going to look today. I think this is something that that has been bothering me for quite a while right now, and I'll tell you why it has been bothering me and why I wanted to carve this topic and talk about it in multiple forums and have that awareness created. So I'll get to that part. But welcome. Um, I think Vanshika already had introduced me before. I'm a principal consultant at ThoughtWorks. Recently released a book called Full Stack Testing with O'Reilly. Um, Play multiple roles in ThoughtWorks Global QA SME for creating skill sets within ThoughtWorks capabilities. Also part of Tech Advisory Board in ThoughtWorks India. So the agenda for today, I think it's a broad topic, right? So to understand what do we mean by evolutionary testing strategy, I would like to start with what is an evolutionary architecture, because it is a extension of evolutionary architecture, and therefore we need to understand what is evolutionary architecture, and why should we even think about evolutionary testing strategy. What is the need for it? That is the part that we will look into next, and then a starter set of practices that we can adopt to implement the evolutionary testing strategy. So that will be what we'll be looking at today. And I'm like, I think when there are questions, it will be towards the end. We can take questions towards the end. So evolutionary architecture. So let's get a brief about evolutionary architecture. So how many of you have already heard about evolutionary architecture? This is a topic that has been around for like at least 4 to 5 years right now. Um, Is there a hands up feature here, or some kind of thumbs up? Or okay, there are a few folks who are giving a thumbs up. Okay, cool. So I think, to give a brief about what is evolutionary architecture, the description goes like this, as you see on the left hand side corner. An evolutionary software architecture supports guided incremental change of the architecture across multiple dimensions. So when we say guided, what they say is guided by fitness functions. That is, we'll get into an introduction of fitness functions as well briefly. But the point is, whenever there is a change in the business requirement, or there is a change in the technical landscape, the software architecture should take that in and be able to survive those changes. An architecture cannot be like something that is written on a paper once and it is left for the next 10 years to come, and then I mean, it doesn't add value. We are seeing a market where the requirements are very volatile. There is a lot of competition, and there is the overwhelming changes in the technical landscape. There is a lot of tools that are coming up. There are a lot of languages, the frameworks and everything are changing in the blink of our eye. And with these kind of market changes and also the technical landscape changes, the software architecture needs to survive its lifetime. So evolvability is one of the non-functional requirements, or if you want, also called as cross-functional requirement, is one of the key features a software architecture has to imbibe into it. So a software architecture needs to have evolvability imbibed into that. And to evolve the software architecture, it needs to be guided, right? Like, it needs to be incremental. So it cannot actually be randomly changing in multiple dimension. It needs to have a guided way to evolve so that it doesn't disrupt the business completely. So that is where the fitness functions comes into picture. So these are all definitions that is from the evolutionary architecture book itself. So fitness function is nothing but a set of objective integrity assessment of software architecture characteristics. And when we say architectural characteristics, it is like the functional requirements that it is feeding to, the business requirements that it is feeding to, the architecture is serving, the cross functional requirements or the non functional requirements that it is trying to embed into. Like, for example, performance is one of the cross functional requirements, and that to serve for performance, the architecture would have been structured in a certain way that it is able to deliver high performance. Similarly, maintainability, you would have very less coupling within the architecture to serve for maintainability. um, Security, there is a lot of security, like there each layer will be separated if it has some very sensitive data, put inside a firewall. All of those things will be catered to by the architecture, and those are called as the architecture characteristics. And what the fitness functions are, as you see in the image in the between, a set of tests, metrics and monitoring systems put into place to give a assessment of whether the architecture is fitting within these characteristics. So therefore, aiding to all the business requirements both from a functional and cross functional perspective. So from a testing perspective, right, like these are nothing but all the kind of automated tests that we'll be writing across both functional and cross functional requirements. So in my full stack testing book as well, I would have covered a lot of functional test automation and the cross functional requirement test automation, varieties across performance, security, data, everything. And this is fitness functions are embedding all of those tests and a little bit more like monitoring systems in place and everything, right? So this is how an architecture will evolve. Basically, the fitness function or the tests will give the feedback on every evolution whenever it is moving from one direction to another direction in one particular dimension. So this is the fundamental of evolutionary architecture, right? Now, what happens when the software architecture and the business requirements are evolving, right? The software architecture will be evolving, catering to a business requirement or a technical landscape change. And we are acknowledging the fact that the software architecture is also imbibing evolvability, and business requirements are given to be evolving at its own pace. But the test strategy hasn't been evolving parallelly. So the reason why I was telling in the beginning of the session that I'm bothered by this is like, even though it seems very obvious that the test strategy has to be evolving parallelly with the software architecture and the business requirements, most often the importance that it gets in a day-to-day life is very little, right? Like there's like fast-paced movement on the business requirement changes. There's a development suddenly starts happening without even planning for any of the testing changes. So that is where, I mean, this is my observation that the test strategy will be done like 5 years ago, and then there's nothing happening beyond that, and it's mostly a reflective changes that happens to all of the testing related stuff in. So that's been the experience so far with most of the clients that I've been working with as a consultant. And this is exactly the result that I see when the test strategy has not been evolving. So like, it's like keeping the test strategy unpolished is like you actually keep one wheel in a tricycle just locked, the other two, the business requirements and software architecture, are moving. What happens? You just like see a downfall in the quality of the product. Eventually the business wouldn't have realized that they have lost the touch to testability in the system itself. They would have lost that ability to test within the product at all, because the test strategy and the everything would have been like left behind when they are running behind the market changes and the new tech landscapes in the development perspective. And finally they would be having a huge tech debt in terms of complete lack of testability after a few years. So most of the clients come to us asking, saying, like, we want to improve our testability right now, we want to increase our quality right now. And how can quality be improved as a posthumous operation, right? Quality should be built in, and testing is one of the aspects that leads to quality. And you have skipped that pathway, and then you are trying to actually build it in a um, in a cycle in a siloed manner after a few years. So that's the effect that comes as a side effect of not evolving the test strategy parallel to business requirements and software architecture uh, in many of the enterprises, in many of the clients that I've seen so far. So just to be very clear on what we mean by test strategy here, right? Test strategy broadly is a combination of the test architecture, the testing process, and a suitable testing capacity to achieve a quality result. So that's what I mean by the test strategy here. It's a very uh, broad definition of a test strategy. There's deployment process, the environment strategy, there's a lot of things that comes into the testing process itself, but broadly, if we have to call it as test architecture, the testing process and the capacity, we can call that as a test strategy here. So let's see with some practical examples of why I see that as a impact, right? Like the impact that I was talking about, the enterprises falling into in a pathway of no testability at all. Let's take a few examples and see what, in those situations, what happens when the test strategy is not evolved. The 5-year plan, right? Like this is this is my favorite one here. Like, uh, suddenly there is this enthusiasm to modernize the legacy technology landscape. There's like 30 to 40 years of legacy code, and suddenly there's an need to move to new technology because the industry is moving, there's skill set gaps. And if you see these sort of modernizing gigs do not have a lot of documentation. There's no SMEs also because people would have moved on, but the legacy code would have stayed on for a very long time, and people won't even remember what the legacy code is supposed to do. It just lives there. And when there is budget, and when there is enthusiasm, suddenly like they'll get into a 5-year plan to procure budget. And what the flyer plan has to support for budget is a high level technical architecture, a proposition of technology choices, and a testing strategy, right? Right. Like, you have to create a 5-year worth of testing strategy. Um, that's how big or how broad the requirement is here. And let's just say that we went about creating such a testing strategy that was like 5 year ahead. What will it even look like, right? Like, what will it really look like? And I mean, people can make an educated guess here. It will be really high level, something like 100,000 feet above. You can actually say that, okay, for a budget procurement on a very high level for this technical architecture, current knowledge of the technology choices, this might be the testing process, the test architecture, and the testing capacity that you need to plan for. But the reality is never the same, right? Like, when you actually get into the delivery mode, the reality is completely different. You might actually have to pause, look back at what was proposed, and keep evolving the requirements as and when you progress. So there is no other way other than evolutionary testing here, in this particular situation. Like every that a strategy is just has to be acknowledged that it is a high level plan, and every now and then, or a set of practices that I will be talking about later, that a strategy needs to be evolved in parallel with the technical architecture, with the business requirement changes throughout the period of the 5-year delivery. The second one, um, let's just say that a team is building a website, um, and there are two backend services, and with a centralized database, right? Like, so given the timelines for go live, the test architecture looks like what is there on the image on the right hand side. So there are E2E UI tests, there are unit tests, and this is the test architecture that the team has come up with, and they have implemented it. They are driving their development through this phase. Suddenly, the business priority changes, right? Suddenly, the business has decided, okay, the website as a product doesn't work anymore. Most of the industry is moving towards API as a product. And so let's actually pivot from here to say that APIs will be our product, and we will check off the website that we have created so far. It's halfway through the delivery, and so it's okay to pivot. And if you look at it from a development perspective, it's like a no brainer because you already have the APIs. What you're doing is just putting some website to depth, and you should be good enough. So the business um, priority changes doesn't really look like a big change from a development perspective or even from a business perspective, because it's all existing. But what happens to the test architecture, right? Like, given the timelines, the team had actually created E2E UI tests and lived with the unit tests. Does it really suffice, right? Like, when API becomes the product, there needs to be an API test, right? Like, what happens to the test architecture? Is somebody looking back at the test architecture to say, okay, your business priority pivoted right now. Now your test architecture needs to change, and where is the capacity coming for that? It's not a simple change that you're looking at. It needs some effort into building a new test architecture. The third example, the software architecture changes, right? Like, let's just say that the team that we were talking about in the previous example went ahead and checking off the website and decided the API as the products. And now suddenly the database is replaced with an event stream system, so that there is less coupling and more cohesion between the downstream systems and more parallel processing, all of those things. So like if it is very much assumed that let, like if we had the team has pivoted to write the API test in the previous case, that should be good enough for the software architecture changes to cover the testing aspects. But is it really enough, right? Like the API test wouldn't be enough even if the team had pivoted from the previous example. We need to pause to think about the asynchronous behavior that the event stream will bring into picture. A transaction could have a lot of changes in the way it behaves because it has become asynchronous right now. And it will be a really sane approach to pause once again to redefine what kind of testing strategy that we need here, what kind of observability we need here to take into the asynchronous behavior into picture, um, and also all that observability, right? Like now it has become parallel processing. What happens to each calls? So where the observability needs to be put into place. All of these things are essential for testing that product with the asynchronous behavior. But most often, once the event stream system is replaced with the database and the API test passes, it just assumed that it is no effect at all on the testing side of things. But the effect will be shown a little later when there are a lot of missing cases that comes into picture because the asynchronous behavior was not tested or not accounted for testing in the when the time the change happened. So once again, a scenario where evolving the testing strategy is absolutely important. Where like when the business requirement changes and software requirement changes. Another example, right? Let's just say that like everything went fine. Immediately what the question will come is, what about the performance, right? Like the team went ahead successfully changing the event stream to from a database, and the website is checked off and API is now a product, and quickly they want to actually see how we can go live. So the real question will be like if it is performant. So performance is often, I mean, unless the team had looked back at the test strategy after they had pivoted from their business requirement change and scope for performance testing at the API layer, this will be a reaction to the reaction rather than a proactive planning aspect, proactive planning for capacity. So this is another example where it's just like a last minute, okay, let's just do performance testing and quickly go live, right? So all of these things will lead to a very less feedback on any kind of real issues that needs to be fixed. So these are things that when I was talking about building quality in, this is like performance building the quality in at a very late stage. Is it becomes like what happens when the performance issue is found out at a very late stage and you just want to go live tomorrow. That's not a conducive environment for the team to cater to, or for the business to survive in a long term. And one more example is so let's just say the team went back and said no, there are performance testing is not possible within the couple of days that is there available before go live, or whatever time period is there before go live. Well, like, sometimes what happens is, to meet the timelines, the business will decide to add more people into the teams, right? Like, there'll be team structure changes. So suddenly you will see that a lot of budget. The budget wouldn't have spent on testing efforts, but the budget will come for increasing the team size and accelerating the delivery of more features. So what happens is, let's just say that the business decides to set up new teams to develop one service independently. In the previous example that we saw, there were two services, right? Like the two APIs. So they decide to actually do parallel development of each of these services, brings new teams into picture to accelerate the timelines. What happens to testing then? So far, the QAs on the team, the testers on the team would have covered all the edge cases because it was within the same domain. But now, when the team structure changes, the knowledge of the system would be very partial for them. Each of them might know what the other team is developing, or might not know completely, which means the process has to evolve. The testing process has to evolve to include a system integration testing, or the some kind of handover mechanism. So this is like, we're talking about just two teams, right? Like, in reality, there'll be more than two teams. We're talking about parallel development of 5 to 6 teams or whatever. So all of these things have an effect on how your testing strategy is impacted. So it might look like a very positive change for the business to actually gear up and bring up more team members, create new team structures, bring more people to accelerate delivery. But what is just not spoken about very loudly, or just pushed under the rug, is what happens to the testing impact, how it impacts the testing strategy. And one last example where, to emphasize why testing strategy should parallelly evolve, is the tech industry changes. Just like how the software architecture has a necessity to evolve to cater to the technology landscape, even the testing landscape has to cater to the technology industry changes. A couple of examples, right? Like APM 2.0 release, some of the previous release features were deprecated. So if the team is developing their test suites in APM 1.0 and they continue to develop APM 1.0 without migrating to APM 2.0, then it means that they are developing a legacy product in itself as they are developing. So that's the impact. So these kind of migration efforts needs to be carved out as a separate effort when they are looking back into the test strategy. So otherwise what happens is, it just like, as I was saying, it's a tech debt that is accumulated for many years, and suddenly they'll come back and say that, okay, we've lost stability, we're not able to move forward, now we need to revamp our testing completely. And that is like a separate project in itself. Revamping the testing efforts, revamping the automation efforts, the test architecture, that's like separate project itself. And most often it's really very rarely achievable to an extent where it is really embedded into the process, right from compared to the embedding the process from the right from the beginning. um like, this is not even a made up case, right? Like, I've seen from my experience where some of the really big enterprises who have lot of money would come back and say that, like, we're still on Selenium RC. Like, why? What were you doing all these years? That would be the reaction to, I mean, it's just that lack of importance on the testing aspects, and unevolving the testing side of things. That's a point that I was talking in the beginning, where I'm quite bothered that the testing evolution isn't happening as parallel to software architecture changes and the business requirement changes. And many innovations also happen, right? It's not only about the tech debt that we collect as we are actually progressing with industry changes, but there are also innovations that are happening in the tech industry, which actually eases our lives in a day-to-day testing. Like, for example, the test containers gives a lot of browsers, the database varieties, and there are some AI reporting tools. Those are industry advancements that will ease our day-to-day lives in the testing world. So this accelerates your development effort as well, right? Instead of actually dragging with the known tools, if you can spend some a little amount of effort into bringing these innovations into the testing strategy, then it actually accelerates your delivery efforts. Making that voice as part of evolving the testing strategy as a process will be greatly appreciated by the team as well. Not only that, there's also changes to legal regulations around data privacy and accessibility in the tech industry changes, which means that whatever that you have as a test strategy to cater to all of these privacy requirements or accessibility requirements have to be revisited. The new requirements needs to be incorporated, but where are we pausing to look back into all of these things? How is the testing strategy being evolved parallelly? So those are some concrete examples where the impact of not evolving the testing strategy will be seen very clearly, even though there's very less importance given to evolving this testing strategy. And from my observation, where it's mostly posthumous, it's mostly reactive to these kind of changes. So that's where this talk is around the evolutionary testing strategy. um, the name, as I said before, is derived from the evolutionary architecture. So, what it emphasizes is we need to evolve the testing strategy in parallel to the software architecture changes, the business requirement changes, and the text landscape changes, guided by the fitness functions itself. The fitness functions is catering to the larger business requirements from a functional and a cross-functional requirement, but these are tests that are written to cater the evolution of the software architecture. The fitness function in themselves need to evolve to cater to the software architecture, and that's what is evolutionary testing strategy is about: evolving the testing process, the testing capacity, the architecture on a continuous manner, and not in a reactive fashion, but in a proactive way. So, some of the starter kit practices to implement this. I think in an agile world, right? Like it might seem like as if this is a known thing, right? Like yeah, mostly if we go back and say that okay, we need to evolve the testing strategy, it might be actually seen like a known thing, especially in an agile world. People will be like, yeah, we need to do it. But the question always comes like, are we doing it really? And how are we doing it? How are we implementing it? Is the team aligned towards a certain set of practices diligently so that the reactiveness comes back to proactiveness? Um, so some of the starter set of practices here will aid in implementing this in a proactive way. First thing is like version controlling the test suites alongside the code, a bare minimum requirement. This is mostly like it need not even be said aloud. It should be the default thing to do. But from experience, I've seen that this is not really something that is followed very diligently. The test suites will be sitting inside a personal laptop. It will not be under a version control system, and therefore if you have to aid incremental changes to your architecture and incremental changes to your test suite, you don't know where the version cutover happens. So version controlling the test suites is like a bare minimum requirement. Next comes the architecture decision records. Architecture decision records, or the ADRs, is nothing but it's a practice where whenever there is a pivot in the architecture, right, like aiding to a software requirement change or a tech landscape change, whenever there is a pivot to an architecture change, it's just agreed upon with the set of stakeholders, because architecture changes impact a larger teams, right? Like it's just not a simple change. Usually, it might be impacting many teams. So those are agreed upon as decision records and kept in log, either, I mean, some documenting format. And there's also similarly, there's a business decision record. So whenever there are business changes, when we are agreeing upon, okay, this is the business priority today, and now we are changing the business priority to something else, that's a business decision record that is kept in place. I mean, it's a good practice to start with, and mostly I've seen good engineering companies follow these kind of practices. So that's a good starting place to record the evolution to the testing strategy as well. So whenever the architecture decision changes, there's a decision record that will have to cater to a evolved testing strategy as well. It should imbibe a new testing strategy, or it should record if there is a new testing changes that needs to be in place. Similarly, from a business decision record as well. So this is like an additional practice that we can implement within the teams, which is already following decision records practice, to react to the change as and when it's happening, and not in a uh, posthumous fashion. And versioning the architecture and the testing strategy together might also be required in places, right? Like when there are pivoting changes, like the event stream system was actually event stream system was used in place of a database, which means that it's a pivoting chain. And sometimes the test that you wrote might not even be suitable for the new kind of architecture changes. So, which means that versioning the test suite is one thing, and also versioning all the combination of the testing process requirements, testing capacity requirements, and the architecture might be required for a long term perspective. So we talk like this is for a, as I said, sometimes the code lives more than the people, right? Like people keep coming in, keep going out of the company, but the code and the system lives longer than the people itself. So to have an archive of what happened with the system, it's good to have how these things pivoted, and therefore having a business case saying that this is why we increase the capacity for testing, and this is what is the benefit that you're getting for increasing the capacity. Those kind of looking back conversations will be useful, because most often the question will be like, what is the business outcome of doing this? Dedicated roles will also be a key factor in driving these practices, right? Like most often, if you see, nobody really thinks that the test strategy shouldn't be evolved. Like if you talk to a architect in the company, or a lead developer, principal engineer, whoever it may be, I don't think logically they would say no, the test strategy shouldn't be evolved. It's just that in the roles and responsibility structure, this is getting a lesser voice, because there's more to do from a development perspective, or there's more to do from an analysis perspective. So having some dedicated roles and responsibilities also helps, like depending upon the scale of the project also, it could be something like a test architect or a head of QA who's given this responsibility to drive this beyond the day-to-day hustles, will give that priority to evolving the test strategy. So if the scale is not that big for a test architect or a head of QA to be in place, then having team level roles and responsibility that gives this evolution of testing strategy as a responsibility will definitely help in keeping this in check. And I think most of the agile practices works fine also for evolution testing strategy. Just that I think if it is being diligently practiced, how much of voice is happening within the team, all of those things comes into picture. So one of the agile practices is in keeping the testers right from the beginning of the software delivery cycle, from ideation, solution design, till taking it to delivery, right? Like this will be really helpful, right? Like when we are on the ideation, solution design phase, if the team looks at it as a combined artifact, if a team looks at testing strategy also as a combined artifact along with the analysis and the solution design, then it becomes a seamless conversation. And that's where I think the testers or the QAs on the team being part of those discussions can drive this particular outcome of keeping the test strategy in check, parallel to the other two things. And few other practices like asking for capacity, right? Like this is a critical conversation. um, and we once again agile planning methods, like in a lower scale and also at a broader scale, like feature or at a business outcome perspective, asking for contingency and allocating that contingency for evolution is going to be very critical. Like the examples that we saw, that we needed to have planned for performance testing earlier, otherwise it's like a reactive measure, just like 2 days in place and you have to go live. Or you should have planned for capacity when your team structure changes. You might probably need a separate phase where you have to do some integration testing. So these kind of planning aspects usually happens within the agile planning methods as well, but it's just that more voice in those forums to, as a collective, not only from the testing perspective, but as a collective, as a team, coming together and seeing how the testing strategy impacts the overall outcome, and therefore allocating contingency for these kind of activities is going to be very critical. And all of these things, right, it doesn't come very quickly as well. I mean, given the uh, given the ways things are, I think it needs more awareness, and mostly it's a matter of actually making the case to the relevant participants, and making that awareness within the team of what happens when you don't evolve your test strategy. Why should you actually do this as a diligent practice alongside your software architecture changes and your tech landscape changes? And that awareness will really help in building that collective alignment towards evolving that testing strategy. And this includes mainly the leaders on the team and also the relevant business stakeholders, right? Like those are the people who would be making some decisions, and they might be in, like mostly it will be like get it done, that kind of an attitude. If it comes from that kind of an attitude, it's going to be, I mean, it's going to be a difficult situation, but nevertheless, I strongly, as I said in the previous examples, it's going to affect them in a later stage. So, creating that voice and creating that awareness across the team, including the leaders and the relevant stakeholders on evolving the testing strategy, is going to be absolutely necessary. So, that's it from me. I'm open for question and answers. Uh, I'm not able to hear you,
I have
Vanchika.
a few questions. I just show them on the stage. So we have a question from Param. The question is the documentation, versioning, dedicated roles. All this might go towards waterfall model with lot of red tapes and bureaucracy. Even when tech giant wants to go small delivery teams, how taking a step back is evolutionary.
So documentation, versioning, dedication, roles, all this might go towards waterfall model with a lot of red tapes and bureaucracy. Even when tech giants want to go small delivery teams. So I think the question is, I believe, if documentation of the testing strategy, will it be a waterfall model? And it can be something that that is adaptable for your team, right? Like and if the product has to live for 30 to 40 years, And if the team is going to have a flux in who comes in, who goes out, and how do we make a case for getting the right capacity, how do we make an argument to the business on what changes that we pivoted and what is the outcome that we have made. I think that is like a pragmatic call, in my opinion, right? Like wherever required, cut down the documentation. But if it helps in making your case, go ahead and do the documentation. If your teams are like really small delivery teams, are just like looking at 6 months delivery plans, and I think you still need a testing strategy for that, right? Like otherwise, it just sits in somebody's head, and that somebody could actually go on leave, somebody could forget. It just becomes the onus on that person to drive the entire conversation. Otherwise, if it is like completely agreed with a certain set of folks, certain set of leaders, it just gives a lot of voice to create a path for evolving the testing strategy as a team instead of that person alone owning that responsibility. And also, one other question was around the roles and responsibilities. I think roles and responsibilities can scale up from the bottom to top as well, right? Like within small teams, the testers could, and the tech lead or whoever is owning the testing angle within the team should be having that responsibility to evolve. That's the point of view here. So when they are embedded with the responsibility to evolve, and the team needs to see it as a collective artifact alongside the architecture changes and alongside the requirements changes. That's a point of view.
Understood. We have a question from Ajay. What is an example of a fitness function?
Yeah, so fitness function, so there are a uh, lot of functional requirements and a lot of cross-functional or non-functional requirements. Let's just say, let me take an example of a non-functional requirement, which is performance. Performance is like your API needs to respond within X milliseconds is a cross-functional or non-functional requirement, which means that you will have a performance test that is hitting the API and validating if the response time is within that X particular milliseconds. So that particular test catering to the requirement will be a part of a fitness functions. And similarly, all of the other tests like security scans, which is catering to catching the vulnerabilities, accessibility scans, even your unit tests, integration tests that is catering to functional requirements, all of these put together is like a collective fitness functions, but it is driven by the business requirement.
Got it. Got it. I hope that answers your question, Ajay. We have a question from Sharon. How do you recommend a tester can evolve their skills to become an effective test architect?
A tester can evolve their skills to become an effective test architect. Um, so test architect, architecture, I would say, is like part and parcel of the tester's job. So just like how you are picking up a new skill in terms of tools, like, let's just say, for example, now that you are exposed to, like, maybe you're entering the testing field, you're seeing the API layer or you're seeing the website as a product. So you start to look at adding tests in website. You start to learn about website tools or the API tools or the mobile tools. Similarly, the test creating test architecture should go parallelly. It's like an incremental um, experience that you get. So you see that, okay, now I'm actually looking at website, what needs to be done at the lower layers. Will it require tests to create faster feedback loop? So it comes along with experience and more of reading on what is the final business outcome that we are trying to achieve, both from an engineering perspective, like the four key metrics and how do we accelerate the engineering metrics, and also from a business outcome. So the test architecture is finally serving the business outcome. So we should be able to make a case towards that business outcome while catering to the engineering metrics as well. So it's an experience, is what I would say.
Got it. Got it. We have a question from Sandeep. We have two questions from him. We'll take that in this session. So the first question is the word product seems selling high. So after seeing software turning to product, now I see API turning to product. In what valuable ways this transition matter?
I think in the example that I was talking about, if that's a question about in one of the slides that I was talking about, I said website as a product. And then the pivot in that example was, instead of website as a product, moving to APIs as a product, which means that you are billing on your APIs directly. You're just like giving that APIs to somebody to plug their UI on top or whatever they do with that. Instead of giving a website, that's like the selling or marketing or the business pivot that is happening. So I don't think there's a difference between software product and the API product. In that example, it was more of a website as a product to an API as a product.
Understood. Another question from Sandeep. What are some good examples of agile planning methodologies?
There are several variations of agile methodologies, right? Like there is extreme programming practices, there's lean. So each of them comes with a flavor of how the planning happens. So in extreme programming practices, for example, there's like a 2 weekly iteration planning meetings. There's also the three amigos process where the planning happens before the iteration planning meetings. There's also a release plan that happens at a much higher level. So depending upon the methodology within the agile broad scale of practices, whichever the team is following, and if the team is realizing the value out of that methodology, is also a question. So most often people would be saying they're following agile, but it'll be like the product is fully developed and then finally pushed outside the boundary for a testing team who's sitting remote, and it's remote in the sense who's not even part of the team, is doing some testing. So uh, there's like partial agile there, where there's like agile only during development and there's no testing. That's also a case that I've seen. So there are different flavors to it, and there are different ways each flavor implement planning methodologies. I've seen XP, which is extreme programming practices, to be very efficient.
Understood. I think that answers all the question. So once again, Gayatri, that was an amazing session by you. I can see a lot of people enjoying it and giving their remarks and their uh, their thought process around the things I was saying in the chat. Thank you so much once again for joining us for this webinar, and it was amazing. And we'll
Thank you.
definitely share the feedback. And I can see a lot of emojis flying in, so that's always good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for staying back. Thank you.
So thank you so much for joining in, and we'll meet you in some other session. Till then, have a good day and happy learning. Thank you, everyone. Bye.